Well, today we're going to have a look at the third option in our exposure triangle, which we've been exploring for the last 4 weeks, 4 sessions that we've had. And when we were talking about composition and tone and light and colour and all the aspects that made amazing images, one of the underlying factors was we actually had to get our exposures right, which is the technical aspect of photography rather than the more artistic aspects of photography. But in terms of the right exposure, we also discussed the fact that we can have photographs that are very dark and moody, and people would sometimes suggest they were underexposed, but that was what we wanted for the look. And other times we have what we call high key photos that are highly exposed and very light and airy, and they give us an emotional feeling of lightness and freshness. And so there's really no such concept as the right exposure. It's the right exposure for the look and feel that you want for your particular image. But our camera, if we just set it on automatic, doesn't give us any choice about whether we make it light or dark. It just gives you what it thinks is the correct exposure. And that's not often what you want. You want the subject well lit, but the background dark. But your camera sees all this background and it ends up making your subject too light while it tries to lighten up the background. So we really do need to know how to control our exposure and not let the camera do it, because we're controlling everything else about what's in the frame and the composition and the subject. So we really need control. And we said there were 3 ways that we could control the amount of light that fell on our sensor. And those were aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. We've discussed in depth about aperture and its capacity to give the emotion in a photograph by giving us a depth of field and allowing us to select exactly what is in focus within our image. It gives our images a much more mature and artistic feel. So aperture is the most important setting. We always start with making sure that the aperture reflects what we want the photo to look like in terms of depth of field. Last time we moved on to shutter speed, and we said that shutter speed could also give us a lot of dynamic feel in our image, and it could also capture things that Alpha Now I can't see, that it's fast enough that it stills really fast motion, and we get to see another perspective of the world if we can freeze that motion. So once we've chosen what's going to be in focus, we then choose about how we see that. Do we see it as blurred motion or do we see it as frozen motion? And so they're the first 2 most important decisions. And the next decision is the ISO button, and it's the ISO button that chooses how dark or light the photo will be. So that's what we're going to move on today. And it controls the sensitivity of the sensor that you're capturing this light on. So we talked about the sensor being little buckets that collected photons of light, and the ISO that we set our camera to makes the decision of how efficiently we capture these photons of light. So I made the analogy that a very low ISO, which is what we tend to start with, is it like a leaky bucket. It captures, for the time that we've got the shutter open, it will let a lot of light leak out. So it's not very efficient at catching light, but higher ISOs are very efficient at catching light, and we can go up to thousands of ISOs in terms of ISO values. And it's very efficient, but there's always a downside. And with any of these things, be careful what you ask for. The word ISO people find is a strange word, and it actually stands for the International Organization of Standardization. And whilst, the order of these letters aren't correct, it's because that's how it's written in French. But in English, we call it the International Standards Organization, but that's its official name. And it comes from the fact that they originally standardized film. So in film, we used to have ASA ratings for film speed, and it was the ISO organization that actually standardized across all of the different film manufacturers what the sensitivity of that film would be. So when we moved from analog to digital photography, the sensor replaced the film. And so because there was already a standard way of measuring sensitivity, they decided to use the same terminology when they were talking about the sensitivity of the sensor. And again, the International Organization of Standardization standardizes that sensitivity across the cameras. So the ISO settings adjust the sensitivity of that sensor, and we can start from the lowest. My camera just says L for the lowest. I've got no idea what that ends up translating to, but I can manually set it at 50, and I think up to at least 25,000. It goes way up. I rarely ever get it up that high. So each time you double the value of your ISO from, say, 100 to 200, then it also doubles the sensitivity of your sensor. When we're talking about doubling the sensitivity and increasing the sensitivity, we're actually not physically changing our sensor. It's to do with it electrically amplifying the photons of light that come and land on your sensor. And so because this is an electrical interpretation of this light, the downside is that it will distort the signal. And that's what happens when we go from a low ISO to a high ISO, that we end up with a lot of interference, just like when you try and amplify with a microphone, you end up with distortion and interference. That's what happens when we try and amplify that signal up to really high values. Now, the modern cameras, the ones built perhaps in the last 5 years, are amazing in their capability of not introducing that distortion and noise. I know in my older camera that I purchased in 2006, if I went up to ISO 400, I ended up with a lot of noise in my photograph. Whereas now I can go up to 2000 with my latest camera, and the noise is very, it's still there, but it's not as pronounced. And the other thing is the software now, I use Lightroom denoise, which is artificial intelligence capability to interpret where the noise is in the photograph and get rid of it. What the downside of that is, of using the denoise button, it makes sure it's not as sharp. It makes your photo softer. But for most times, that's not a big issue. And it does allow you to avoid this noise that you get at these higher ISOs. So what we call is native ISO or base ISO in our cameras. Different cameras have a different, what they call their base ISOs, but most of them are around about ISO equals 100. So at ISO equals 100, you can guarantee to get almost zero noise. That's the sensitivity in which there is no amplification of how the electrical signal is stored from those photons of light. So that's what we always start with. And where ISO comes in very useful is once we've chosen the aesthetic look of our photograph and aesthetically what the depth of field will be and how much blur we want in terms of movement or how sharp we want it in terms of movement, we don't want to be changing our aperture and our shutter speed to get the exposure we want. What we do want to change is our ISO. So this is where we adjust our ISO to make our sensor more sensitive when we need more light. Now, this is what I mean by noise. And I'm sure that you've all seen it in your photographs when if your camera has been set on automatic and you've taken a photograph in a really dark environment, your camera will automatically up the ISO to cater for that being very dark and allow your sensor to be more sensitive. And then when you try and print these out or see them on the screen, you'll see this dotty pixelated look. When you just have it in your phone or a small thumbnail, it looks like this does here. I took this in a cave where I was taking it at a distance and the flash wouldn't reach there. So I had to really increase my ISO in order to take this photo. And when it's in a small thumbnail size that you would normally see on a phone screen, it's fine. It's just if you want to print this, you end up with all of these color aberrations. You can see that it's putting in all the shadows, it's putting in color because in the amplification, it's distorting and not seeing the color correctly. So it's the weird magentas and cyans that you start getting into your photos. You're thinking, where did that color come from? And it's come from that amplification of your sensor. So I've said we set the aperture first to get our depth of field and our aesthetic of our image. We set the shutter speed to deal with the length of lens we've got, because as soon as we start to use a long lens, we need to use a shutter speed that's at least the inverse distance of that lens. And we need to judge how fast the subject is moving. So if we're taking a bird, we need to get at least a thousandth of a second in our shutter speed. But we may set those two and suddenly find that the photo is really dark. What do we need to do now? Well, we need to increase our ISO until we get up to an exposure that is appropriate. And so how do we tell what that exposure is that makes it appropriate? Well, there's three ways of looking at it in your camera. If you're on your phone, you can only just have a look at what it looks like in your phone. But when you're actually shooting manually on your camera, you can see this three different ways. One is the exposure compensation indicator, and we're going to have a look what that is, but you've probably seen it in your viewfinder and thought, I wonder what I'm looking at here. The other is with the modern cameras, ones produced in the last few years, actually simulate the exposure in the viewfinder LED screen. So as you change your settings, it will get brighter and duller because it's actually simulating it. Now, it's not terribly accurate, and depending on the brightness of the sunlight that you're looking at under, it's often difficult to see. But it does give you a fairly good indication. Just don't rely on it. The other thing is that you can see is your histogram. And again, in modern cameras, that histogram is live. So you can see it through your live view screen, that as you change these adjustments, you can see that histogram moving from the left to the right and back again. And what we said, we try and aim to get that histogram with all its pixels between the two goalposts. And we try and make sure that it's not overexposed because we don't want to go there, because once it's overexposed, we can't bring it back. So they're the three ways we can look at it. So we'll have a look at the first one first, this exposure compensation indicator. And it allows us to see, is the photo underexposed? If it's at the minus end, if this arrow is here, it says your photo's way underexposed. If it's just here, it says it's slightly underexposed. If it's right on the 0, as far as the camera is concerned, it's got most of the pixels on the histogram. As soon as we go up this end, it means our photograph's going to be slightly overexposed. Now, for high key images, we tend to have it probably about +1 because that's the look we're going for. And for low key images, the darker images, we tend to set our camera down here. So, being on 0 is optimally correct and is something we aim for most of the time. When we're trying to introduce tone as being part of our aesthetic composition, then we may move it, we may adjust our exposures so that it's either side of the 0. But this is, start off trying to aim for the 0. It may look a bit different in other cameras, but you'll see it in your viewfinder. So you can also see it when you're looking at your top of your camera. Sometimes it will display there. And remember, if it's moving to the left, it's saying that your photograph's going to be darker than what it considers to be optimal. And if it's moving to the right, it considers your photograph is brighter than what it considers to be optimal. So what this is saying when it's -2 is that it's two stops underexposed. And when it's +1, it means that it's 1 point, right up here, just past 1. This is 1.3 stops overexposed. It depends on the look we're going for, but usually we sort of aim for something in the middle. I often shoot like this because I'm aiming for that really, really bright spot, which I know will sit up here, the one bright spot, but 90% of my photo is dark. And you'll often see I'll take photos of flowers like that, where the background's completely dark and the flower's light. And that's when I deliberately underexpose, because I want my background to be dark, because I know my flower then will come back to here and be properly exposed. So this is, start with 0 and then start playing what the different looks would look like. The third way to see what our exposure looks like is by looking at our histogram. And we did a lot of study on how to find your histogram, how to read your histogram. And one of the things that we identified was that ideally all of our pixels are somewhere between these two goalposts. We rarely ever want it to be on the right hand side, our pixels to be right up against this goalpost, because what that means is that we've way overexposed them and we've virtually burnt out our sensor at that point. It can no longer record color or detail, or tone. It is just pure white. When it's right up this end, it's going to be pure black. And we've found, yes, in editing software, we can drag it back, but when we do, that's when we introduce that noise. So ideally, when we're looking at our live view and we're looking at our histogram, it'll look something like this. So now I'm going to talk about shooting on manual. And all of you, as part of what we've been doing, we've been looking at the different modes that we can shoot under. And our phone, we shoot in automatic mode. We can tell it different modes in terms of portrait or landscape or creative modes. But at the end of the day, it decides how it's going to take it. A number of you are shooting on aperture priority, and that's a great way to dip your toe in the water for shooting manually, because aperture priority allows you to choose the aesthetic in terms of what will be in focus and what won't be. What it does, though, is adjust your shutter speed to get the exposure. And we've seen how shutter speed is really important to control blur and to make sure your subject is in focus. If you've got camera shake, then your subject will be blurry. So aperture priority is a good way to start shooting semi-manually, but really it's about biting the bullet and getting into manual mode. Once it's hard to start, and it's like anything in life that when you've always been really comfortable in just letting your camera make the decisions. If you get used to shooting in manual mode, you take your creativity to absolutely the next level, because you can make anything happen in that camera. And that's when things get really exciting. So I'm going to tell you about manual mode this week, and it's this M on your mode button. You just switch it around to be shooting on M, and once you're there, you get to choose the aperture, you get to choose the shutter speed, and you get to choose the ISO. So if you were shooting on automatic, like if you can choose the concept of macro on your phone, then if you were just doing this sort of shot, you would choose macro. But if you're using a semi-automatic mode, you would use aperture priority. Or, as I shot this, I shot it on manual. And that allowed me to get the depth of field that I wanted. And also I was using a long lens, so I could ensure that I had the shutter speed that I needed. And so I've given you sort of the options here. If you were shooting on an automatic mode, you choose landscape. If you went to semi-automatic, you could choose aperture priority. And if you were doing that, you would probably use an aperture of about 11 to make sure that you got foreground, midground, and background sharp. Or you can choose manual and set the aperture to 11. Night shooting, you can either use night portrait as an automatic mode in your camera, or you can put your camera on a tripod and use a extended shutter speed of 8 seconds, because we're wanting to get a sharp foreground, midground, and background, we've got on F11. Again, we can use portrait mode or aperture priority. In this case, this was a photo I took of Ruby Wax, and I wanted it, this was for the age, I wanted it to be perfect. And when I want it to be perfect, I shoot in manual because I can control everything. I'm not letting the camera to make decisions. And I definitely wanted this man in the background out of focus. So I've given you, within this slide, you can see when you choose things like aperture priority, your camera's metering determines the corresponding shutter speed. And this is what used to drive me nuts when I used aperture priority. I'd be always using a long lens, and my camera would choose to slow down the shutter speed to give me the light I needed, but I would then get camera shake. So this is why I go to fully automatic mode that allows me to be fully in control of what I'm doing. And it also has a wonderful feedback loop in your head, in that you go, oh, that's what happens when I go to F11. That's what happens when I go to F4. Oh, the shutter speed I need to get the birds not blurry is 1,000th of a second. You know, you might have tried it originally at 200th and had a look at the photo when it's blurry. So it just is a wonderful training mechanism for you to know what you need for different situations. So I'm just going to step you through the steps of what it takes to take a photo in manual mode. And, you know, I can't emphasize enough how my photography went from very ordinary to a lot better once I was in control of what my images looked like. So these are the steps. We set our ISO to 100 because at this point, We don't know what it should be, but 100 is ideal because that's the value that we're not going to get any noise. So it's like the base value. Set it on 100, the ISO of choice. We then set the aperture to what we want for our aesthetic, our depth of field, and what we want in focus and what we don't want in focus. And we focus on our subject. So we move our focal point to be on our subject, because usually that's what we want to be in sharp focus. Once we've decided what we want that aesthetic to look like, we've got to then work out how fast do we need that shutter speed. And the first thing is, how long is my lens? If I'm using a 400 lens, I need to have it at least a 400th of a second. If I'm using a 50mm lens, I need it at least a 50th of a second. So I know what my minimum is. So I can then just adjust my shutter speed to get my exposure right, as long as it's greater than the minimum. If at the shutter, but sometimes I might want to, perhaps for a, for a still subject, I won't want, yeah, well, for the still subject, I might be using a 24mm lens, say for a portrait, and it says that 1/24th is the slowest shutter speed I can use. However, if I use that, if someone blinks, they'll blur. And people need to be shot at, I usually go at least 100th of a second. If they're moving or blinking or shifting their head, they need at least 100th of a second. So I need to go up to that value to adjust the shutter speed so I don't get just blinking and head movement. If my shutter speed is too slow, it will cause blur. And if I'm shooting a still subject like a still life, put your camera on a tripod, and that allows you to go down to that low shutter speed and allows you to keep the ISO at 100. So just make your adjustments then, knowing what you know about camera shake and about lens length for your shutter speed. And the next thing you do, if you can't get that exposure compensation to be reading 0, is adjust your ISO, and then you shoot. So when you finish shooting, check your histogram. Is it right? Done. You've got the shot. So that's all you need to do, and that's the steps that you go through for a still subject. Sometimes we're shooting windy subjects or sport or birds or animals or very active children, and we need to be very, very conscious of the shutter speed in this case. And there's no point in putting your camera on a tripod because you need that high shutter speed. Like the tripod's not going to help you. You just need a shutter speed that can deal with it. But again, we go through the same steps. Set your ISO to 100, get your aperture correct, because even if you're shooting sport or active children, you want the focal plane to be on your subject. So, and the background blurred, because that really makes your images pop when your subject's sharp and the background is blurry. If you're shooting landscape and it's windy, then you need an aperture that deals with foreground, midground, and background, but a shutter speed that will deal with windy trees, because otherwise you'll just have blurs in front of you. We go through the same steps. We just need to make sure that the shutter speed is high enough for both the movement of your subject and the movement of your camera if you've got a long lens on. So if your exposure is too dark, then you can increase your ISO. If your exposure is too bright, then rather than increase our ISO, if I'm shooting a moving subject, I just increase the shutter speed, because it doesn't matter. As long as sometimes if I'm shooting a moving subject, I do want them to blur. I want that shadowy, ghostly feel. I'm not going to increase my shutter speed in that case. But my shutter speed is usually my first thing to increase, if I can. Once I've achieved the minimum I need, and it's still too bright, so I'm shooting a person and I've got it on 100 and the photo is still too bright, I don't want to go less than ISO 100, so I increase my shutter speed until that exposure compensation comes back to 0. So it's just getting you used to this set of steps, and they become automatic. It's a bit like driving a car. If you had to describe to someone what you do when you get in a car to start it and drive off, you'd be hard pressed to know what do I do first? Do I put the blinker on? Do I turn the car on? Do I put my foot on the brake? And someone would, like your driving instructor, would say, now this is what you do. Sit down, put your seatbelt on, check your rear vision mirror. They will give you the steps. Now you don't even think about it, and I don't even think about it. It just happens. My fingers know the dials, and I know in my brain, I've done this, I've done this, I've done this, I've done this, and I shoot. And I do this for every single photo. Now, the exposure triangle is a bit like, I don't know whether many of you have ever been exposed to the project management triangle, which is exactly the same. Is that you get to, you've got 3 variables, and you get to choose 2 of them, and the third one is whatever it has to be. So in project management, you can say to people, do you want everything exactly as your requirements? Well, that's what you want, and you want it as fast as possible. Yes, well, it's not going to be cheap. If you want everything to your requirements and as cheap as possible, well, it's not going to be fast. If you want things fast and cheap, you're not going to get what you want. And that's exactly what happens with our exposure triangle, is that we get our aperture that we want, we get our shutter speed that we want, and our ISO just has to be sacrificed. And it's it's the sacrificial lamb that we have. So just don't start with a high ISO, make it the thing that you have to give up. So I want you to have a play around with ISO, and for your own satisfaction, have a look what it looks like when you're in a dark space, like go inside to a dark room and really increase your ISO up and take a photo, and then have a look on your screen what that looks like when it's in the thousands, and you'll see really grainy and really awful looking. So just do that to have a bit of a play. Set your camera to manual mode, and even for next week when we go on our workshop, when you start off, just put it on manual mode and go, today I'm going to sacrifice for the first half hour every photo I take if I don't get it right, but I'm going to have a try what Pam tells me. Start with your ISO of 100, prioritize your aesthetic with your aperture, make sure that you get your minimum shutter speed to allow for the level of movement that you need, and if it's too dark, increase your ISO. And it's like a cycle there. And shoot, check your histogram and adjust your ISO accordingly. So thank you for today, and good luck with shooting manually.